Victor Blackwood thought he knew everything about his household staff. But when he came home early from a business trip and heard his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, speaking in perfect sentences from her playroom, something she'd never done before, he discovered his quiet maid, Rosa Martinez, doing something that would change everything. What he witnessed next left him speechless, and his response would shock Rosa to her core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The marble floors of the Blackwood mansion echoed with the sharp click of Victor's Italian leather shoes as he rushed through the grand foyer, his phone pressed against his ear. Another crisis at Blackwood Industries demanded his immediate attention. Another fire to extinguish in his empire of tech startups and real estate ventures. Tell the board I'll be there in 20 minutes. He barked into the phone, barely glancing at the elegant oil paintings that lined the hallway. Masterpieces worth more than most people's homes. Yet they meant nothing to him beyond their monetary value. Emma sat in her specialized chair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her small fingers tracing patterns in the air that only she could see. At 8 years old, she was beautiful like her late mother Catherine, with the same golden curls and bright green eyes. But Emma lived in a world largely separate from everyone else's, a world of autism that Victor had never learned to navigate. "Emma, Daddy has to go to work," he said, his voice softening slightly as he approached her. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence, just continued her repetitive hand movements while humming a tune only she could hear. Victor's jaw tightened. 3 years since Catherine's death, and he still felt helpless around his own daughter. The guilt gnawed at him daily. How could a man who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals be so utterly lost when it came to connecting with his own child? Rosa Martinez appeared silently from the kitchen, her presence as unobtrusive as always. She was 32, though her reserved demeanor made her seem older. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same modest grey uniform she'd worn every day for the past 2 years since joining the household staff. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, her slight accent coloring her words. "Emma had her breakfast. The occupational therapist will be here at 11. Good. Make sure she's ready." Victor was already moving toward the door, his mind shifting back to quarterly reports and acquisition targets. "I'll be late tonight. Board dinner." Rosa nodded, watching as he disappeared through the front entrance without a backward glance. She'd grown accustomed to his routine, always rushing, always distant from Emma, as if his daughter's condition was something he could delegate to others, like everything else in his life. But Rosa saw what he couldn't, or wouldn't. She saw the intelligence flickering behind Emma's green eyes. The way the little girl would sometimes pause in her movements when Rosa spoke Spanish, as if she understood every word. She saw how Emma's face would light up during their quiet moments together. Moments that Victor never witnessed because he was always somewhere else. The house fell into its familiar rhythm after Victor left. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly housekeeper, bustled about with her morning routine. James, the groundskeeper, tended to the expansive gardens visible through the mansion's many windows. And Rosa settled into what had become her most important role, though it wasn't in any job description. "Buenos dias, pequeña," Rosa whispered to Emma, settling cross-legged on the Persian rug beside her chair. "Good morning, little one." Emma's humming paused for just a moment, a response that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. But Rosa had learned to read these subtle signs. Over the past year, she'd noticed patterns in Emma's behavior that the expensive specialists seemed to miss. The way Emma would organize her toys in complex sequences. How she'd become agitated when her routine was disrupted, but calm when Rosa spoke to her in both English and Spanish. The intelligence that shone through during their quiet interactions. Rosa had been a teacher back in Guatemala, before circumstances forced her to leave everything behind and start over in America. She'd specialized in working with children who learned differently, children the system often overlooked or misunderstood. When she'd taken the job with the Blackwood family, She'd intended to save money and eventually return to teaching. But Emma had changed everything. "Let's practice our letters today, see?" Rosa said, pulling out a set of colorful letter blocks from Emma's toy collection. But these weren't just random blocks. Rosa had carefully selected educational materials, using her own limited savings to supplement what was available in the house. What followed would have amazed Victor, had he been there to see it. Rosa had developed her own methods, combining traditional teaching techniques with approaches specifically designed for children on the autism spectrum. She used visual cues, repetitive patterns, and multisensory learning, all things she'd learned during her teaching career but had never had the chance to use since arriving in America. "Show me the letter A." "Emma," Rosa said, arranging several blocks on the carpet. Emma's eyes focused on the blocks, and slowly, deliberately, she reached out and touched the correct one. "Muy bien, very good." This wasn't just play. It was systematic education, tailored specifically to Emma's needs and learning style. Rosa had been quietly documenting Emma's progress in a notebook she kept hidden in her room, tracking improvements that the official reports to Victor never captured. The real breakthrough had come 3 months ago when Emma had suddenly looked directly at Rosa and said "Rosa" while pointing to a red flower in one of her picture books. Not just the word for red in Spanish, but Rosa's name, a connection that had brought tears to the maid's eyes. Since then, Emma's vocabulary had been expanding steadily, but only when she was alone with Rosa. "Let's practice our sounds," Rosa continued, pulling out homemade flashcards she'd created. Each card combined images with letters, using a teaching method called structured literacy that she'd learned was particularly effective for children with autism. Emma's response was immediate and focused. She began pointing to letters, making sounds, even attempting to form words. Her movements became less repetitive and more purposeful when engaged in these learning activities. It was as if Rosa had found the key to unlock a door that everyone else assumed was permanently sealed. The morning session continued with Rosa guiding Emma through basic math concepts using colored counting bears, then transitioning to a social story Rosa had written about making friends. Each activity was carefully planned and executed with the skill of a trained educator, not the casual attention of a babysitter. As Emma worked through the exercises, Rosa couldn't help but feel the familiar ache of wasted potential. Here was a child capable of so much more than anyone realized. Trapped in a household where her father saw only limitations and her expensive specialists focused only on managing behaviors rather than nurturing growth. Victor Blackwood paid for the best of everything, the finest therapists, the most expensive schools, the latest treatments. But he'd never thought to ask Rosa, his humble maid from Guatemala, what she observed during the hours she spent with Emma each day. He'd never noticed that Emma's most significant progress happened not during the formal therapy sessions he paid thousands for, but during the quiet moments when a woman who cleaned his house became the teacher his daughter desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on Rosa. She'd come to America with a master's degree in special education, years of experience working with exceptional children, and a passion for unlocking their potential. But circumstances had forced her into a role where her expertise remained invisible, her contributions unrecognized, her impact unmeasured by anyone except the little girl whose world she was quietly transforming. One letter and one word at a time. As the morning progressed, Rosa continued Emma's lessons, unaware that today would be different, unaware that Victor's business trip would be cut short, unaware that her secret world of teaching and Emma's hidden world of learning were about to collide with a father who thought he knew everything about his own home, but was about to discover he knew nothing at all. The Singapore deal had collapsed spectacularly at 2 a.m. local time, leaving Victor staring at his laptop screen in his penthouse hotel suite as millions of dollars evaporated into the digital ether. His business partner, Chen Wei, had pulled out at the last minute, citing unforeseen complications that Victor knew were really about Chen's cold feet regarding the new AI regulations. 18 months of work down the drain, Victor muttered, closing the laptop with more force than necessary. The city lights of downtown Los Angeles sprawled beneath his window, but all he could see were the numbers, the lost revenue, the wasted investments, the domino effect this would have on his other projects. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, jet ready for departure. ETA home, 11:30 a.m. Victor had planned to stay in LA for 3 more days, but there was no point now. Better to get home and start damage control immediately. He'd need to call an emergency board meeting, restructure the quarterly projections, and figure out how to spin this disaster to the shareholders. The flight back to Chicago felt interminable. Victor spent the entire journey on calls with his legal team, his CFO, and his head of acquisitions, each conversation more frustrating than the last. By the time his driver pulled through the iron gates of his Winnetka estate, Victor's mood was as dark as the storm clouds gathering overhead. "Welcome home." "Mr. Blackwood," James called from the garden, where he was securing the outdoor furniture against the approaching weather. "Wasn't expecting you until Thursday." Victor barely acknowledged him, his mind still churning through contingency plans and damage assessments. He needed his home office, his files, and about 6 cups of coffee to figure out how to salvage what was left of this mess. The house was unusually quiet as he entered through the side door that led directly to his study. Mrs. Henderson must have been upstairs doing her weekly deep clean of the guest rooms. Perfect. He wouldn't have to make small talk about his early return or explain why the Singapore expansion had imploded. Victor was halfway to his office when he heard something that made him freeze mid-stride. "The cat sat on the mat," came a clear, articulated voice from the direction of Emma's playroom. "Rosa, the cat sat on the mat." Victor's briefcase slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a loud crack that echoed through the hallway. That voice, high and sweet and unmistakably Emma's, had just spoken a complete sentence, multiple complete sentences, with perfect pronunciation and inflection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His daughter, who had never strung 3 words together in her entire life, was having a conversation. "Excelente, Emma." "Excellent," came Rosa's voice, warm with pride. "And now can you tell me what color the cat is?" "The cat is orange, Rosa, orange like the flower in Mama's garden." Victor felt his legs go weak. Emma wasn't just speaking. She was making connections, referencing memories, engaging in actual dialogue. The specialists had told him this might never happen, that he should focus on basic communication goals rather than hoping for conversational speech. Moving as quietly as his dress shoes would allow on the marble floor, Victor crept toward Emma's playroom. The door was slightly ajar, giving him a perfect view of what was happening inside. What he saw stopped him cold. Rosa was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by educational materials Victor had never seen before. Not the expensive therapeutic toys he'd purchased or the specialized equipment recommended by Emma's team, but carefully organized homemade learning stations, flashcards with pictures and words, letter tiles arranged in neat rows, a small whiteboard covered with simple sentences, and Emma, his Emma who supposedly couldn't focus, couldn't learn through traditional methods, couldn't connect with the world around her, was actively participating in what looked like a structured lesson. "Let's try this story." "Pequeña," Rosa said, holding up a laminated booklet. "This is about a little girl who loves to count." Emma's eyes immediately focused on the book, her body language completely different from the distant, disconnected posture Victor was used to seeing. She was leaning forward, engaged, eager. "Once upon a time," Rosa began, "there was a girl named Luna who loved numbers. She counted everything: birds in the sky, flowers in the garden, cookies in the jar." "How many cookies, Rosa?" Emma interrupted, and Victor had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling over. Emma had asked a question, a relevant, contextual question that showed she was not only following the story, but thinking ahead. The book says, 7 cookies. Can you show me 7 with your fingers? Emma held up both hands, then carefully folded down 3 fingers, leaving 7 extended. 7 cookies for Luna. That's right. Now Luna's mama needed help counting all the ingredients for a special dinner. Victor watched in stunned silence as Rosa continued the lesson, seamlessly weaving education into storytelling. She wasn't just reading to Emma. She was teaching reading, math, comprehension, and social skills all at once. Every question Rosa asked was carefully crafted to challenge Emma at just the right level. And Emma was rising to meet every challenge. Rosa, Emma said suddenly, why doesn't Daddy read stories like this? The question hit Victor like a physical blow. Through the gap in the door, he saw Rosa's expression grow sad. Your daddy is very busy, mi amor. He works very hard to take care of you, but you work hard too. You clean and cook and teach me letters. Why don't I have school like other kids? Victor's throat tightened. Emma was aware, more aware than he'd ever imagined. She understood that she was different from other children, and understood that she was missing something they had. You are having school, Emma. Right here, with me. We're learning so many things together, verdad? Remember yesterday when you wrote your name all by yourself? Emma beamed. I wrote to Emma Rose Blackwood with no help. She could write her full name. Victor felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The last report from her occupational therapist had stated that Emma showed minimal progress in fine motor skills and might need alternative communication methods for the foreseeable future. Should we practice writing today? Rosa asked, pulling out a notebook Victor didn't recognize. Yes. Can I write a letter to Daddy? To tell him about the orange cat? Rosa hesitated and Victor saw something flicker across her face. Concern, maybe even fear. Maybe we should practice other letters first, pequeña. What would you like to write about? But Emma was already reaching for a pencil, her movements careful but determined. I want to write, Dear Daddy, I can read now. Love, Emma. Victor watched his daughter form letters with painstaking precision, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The handwriting was shaky but legible, each letter carefully crafted. When she finished, she held up the paper with pride. Look, Rosa. I wrote to Daddy. It's beautiful, Emma. Your writing is getting so much better. When will Daddy come home? I want to show him. He's traveling for work, remember? He'll be home on Thursday. Victor's chest tightened with guilt. Here was his daughter, accomplishing things he'd been told were impossible, and she wanted nothing more than to share her progress with him. But he was never home. Always traveling, always in meetings, always somewhere else. Rosa, Emma said quietly, do you think Daddy will be proud of me? The vulnerability in his daughter's voice nearly undid him. Rosa's face softened as she pulled Emma into a gentle hug. Oh, mi niña, your daddy loves you so much. He would be so proud if he could see how hard you're working, how much you're learning. Then why doesn't he ever play school with me like you do? Rosa was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to answer. Victor held his breath, wondering what she would say. Sometimes grown-ups get scared, Emma. Your daddy loves you, but I think maybe he doesn't know how to help you learn the way I do. That doesn't mean he doesn't want to. It just means he needs to learn too. Victor closed his eyes, the truth of Rosa's words cutting deep. He had been scared. Terrified, actually. Terrified of his daughter's diagnosis. Terrified of doing the wrong thing. Terrified of failing her the way he felt he'd failed Catherine by not being there when she needed him most. So instead of trying, he'd hired people. Thrown money at the problem. Bought the best services and equipment and therapies, then retreated to his office where he understood the rules, where success could be measured in dollars and market share. He'd never considered that the solution might not cost millions of dollars, that it might come from the quiet woman who cleaned his house and cared for his daughter with a dedication that no amount of money could buy. Opening his eyes, Victor saw Emma and Rosa working together on what looked like a math worksheet. Emma's face bright with concentration and joy. This was his daughter, not the distant, unreachable child he'd convinced himself she was, but a bright, capable little girl who'd been waiting for someone to believe in her potential. And Rosa wasn't just a maid from Guatemala. She was a teacher, an educator who'd been transforming Emma's life one lesson at a time, asking for nothing in return except the chance to help a child learn. Victor's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and cancelled his afternoon meetings. The Singapore deal, the board crisis, the financial restructuring, none of it mattered now. For the first time in 3 years, he had something more important to do than work. He needed to have a conversation with Rosa Martinez. And then, if she'd let him, he wanted to learn how to play school with his daughter. Victor remained frozen outside the playroom door for another 10 minutes, watching his daughter navigate through what Rosa called story problems, math equations disguised as adventures about pirates counting treasure and princesses dividing cake among friends. Emma's enthusiasm for each problem was infectious, her small hands gesturing excitedly as she worked through the solutions. If Captain Seabeard has 12 gold coins and gives 4 to his first mate, how many does he have left? Rosa asked, sliding colourful coin tokens across the carpet. Emma arranged the tokens carefully, counting under her breath. 12 take away 4 is 8. Captain Seabeard has 8 coins left, but Rosa, why would he give away his treasure? The question caught Rosa off guard, and she laughed, a sound Victor realized he'd rarely heard in his house. Maybe because good captains take care of their crew, Pequeña. What do you think? I think he was sharing because sharing makes people happy. Like when you share your cookies with me. Victor's chest tightened. When had Rosa been sharing her own food with Emma? The kitchen was fully stocked. The staff had access to whatever they needed. Yet apparently, Rosa had been bringing her own treats to share with his daughter. He thought of all the expensive nutritional supplements and specialized snacks he'd ordered for Emma, recommended by her dietitian and approved by her pediatrician. Meanwhile, simple cookies shared with genuine affection had meant more to Emma than any of those carefully calculated purchases. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Rosa said softly. "Now shall we practice your writing? I have something special planned today." She pulled out a composition notebook, not one of the expensive therapeutic writing tools Victor had purchased, but a simple school notebook with wide ruled lines. The cover was decorated with stickers that Emma had apparently chosen herself, butterflies, rainbows, and letters of the alphabet. "Today, we're going to write about our favorite things," Rosa announced. "I'll help you with the spelling, but the ideas are all yours." Emma clapped her hands together. "Can I write about Mama's garden? And about you teaching me numbers?" "Of course. Let's start with Mama's garden. What do you remember about it?" What followed was 15 minutes of the most natural, flowing conversation Victor had ever heard Emma participate in. She spoke about her mother's rose bushes, about the way the flowers smelled in the morning, about a butterfly she'd seen that was yellow like sunshine. Rosa gently guided her toward writing these thoughts down, helping with letter formation and spelling while encouraging Emma's creativity and memory. But it was Emma's next comment that nearly brought Victor to his knees. "Rosa, do you think Mama would be happy that I can write now? Dr. Peterson said I might never be able to do school things like other kids." Dr. Peterson, the developmental specialist Victor paid $300 an hour to evaluate Emma's progress. The same doctor who'd recommended lowering expectations and focusing on life skills, rather than academic achievement. "Oh, mi niña," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mama would be so proud. She would be amazed to see how smart you are, how hard you work, how many wonderful things you can do." But why did Dr. Peterson say I couldn't learn like other kids? "I can read and I can write and I know my numbers up to 100. 100. Victor felt dizzy. Emma could count to 100 and he'd had no idea. Rosa chose her words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups don't see everything that children can do. It doesn't mean they're bad people, Emma. It just means they need time to understand how special and capable you are." Emma nodded solemnly, then returned to her writing with renewed focus. Victor watched her form sentences about her mother's garden, about learning letters with Rosa, about wanting to read chapter books someday, like the big kids at the library. The library. Another revelation. Rosa had been taking Emma to the public library. Victor's mind raced through the implications. Rosa was exposing Emma to experiences he'd never considered, giving her access to a normal childhood he'd assumed was impossible. While he'd been scheduling therapy appointments and medical consultations, Rosa had been quietly providing Emma with education, socialization, and hope. "Rosa," Emma said suddenly, looking up from her notebook, "will you always be my teacher, even when I get bigger?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Victor thought he knew about his household, his daughter, and his future plans. Rosa's face went pale. Emma, I don't know what will happen when you get bigger. Sometimes things change, but I don't want things to change. I want to keep learning with you. You make learning fun, not scary like when the other teachers come here." Victor's stomach dropped. Emma found her professional therapists scary. The team of specialists he'd assembled, the people he trusted with his daughter's development, were frightening her rather than helping her flourish. "Learning should be fun," Rosa agreed quietly. "And you are such a good learner, Emma, so curious and smart and brave. Will you teach me to read chapter books?" Mrs. Henderson said there are stories about girls who solve mysteries and go on adventures. If your daddy says it's okay, we can try some easier chapter books. But it has to be okay with your daddy first. Emma's face fell slightly. "Daddy's always too busy for school things. Maybe we can surprise him when he comes home. Show him how much I can read now?" "Maybe, pequeña. We'll see." But Victor could hear the doubt in Rosa's voice, the careful way she avoided making promises about his involvement. How many times had Emma asked to share her progress with him? How many times had Rosa had to deflect those requests because he was traveling, or in meetings, or simply too preoccupied to notice his daughter's transformation? The weight of his failures as a father crashed over him like an avalanche. Emma wasn't just learning, she was thriving, growing, becoming everything he'd been told she couldn't become. And she wanted desperately to share that journey with him. But he'd been too blind and too absent to see it. "Let's practice reading now," Rosa said, reaching for a beginner chapter book that looked well worn from use. "This is about a girl named Junie B. Jones who gets into silly situations." Emma's entire face lit up. "I love Junie B. She's funny and she makes mistakes, but she keeps trying." Victor listened as Emma read aloud, stumbling occasionally over longer words, but pushing through with determination. Her reading level was easily that of a typical second grader, maybe higher. The specialists had suggested she might eventually learn to recognize basic sight words. Instead, she was reading actual books, discussing characters, understanding plot development. When Emma finished the chapter, Rosa asked comprehension questions that would have challenged any 8-year-old. Emma answered thoughtfully, making connections between the story and her own experiences, demonstrating critical thinking skills that supposedly weren't possible for children with her level of autism. "Rosa, why doesn't Junie B's daddy help her with homework in the stories?" "Well, in the books, Junie B's daddy is working a lot, just like your daddy. But some daddies are different. Some daddies help with homework and read bedtime stories. Do you think my daddy would read to me if I asked him?" Rosa hesitated. "I think your daddy loves you very much, Emma. Sometimes daddies need to learn how to show love in new ways." Emma nodded, then returned to her book with the intense focus that Victor now realized wasn't a sign of disconnection, but deep concentration and genuine engagement with learning, as he watched Rosa guide Emma through increasingly complex activities. Creative writing, basic geography using a homemade map, even simple science experiments with household items. Victor began to understand the magnitude of what he'd been missing. This wasn't just tutoring or therapy. This was a complete educational program, tailored specifically to Emma's learning style and interests, delivered with the skill of a master teacher and the devotion of someone who truly cared about Emma's growth. Rosa Martinez wasn't just his maid. She was Emma's teacher, mentor, advocate, and quite possibly the reason his daughter was developing, beyond every professional prediction, and he'd been paying her. $18 an hour to clean his house. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Rosa had been providing Emma with what amounted to a private, specialized education, the kind that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if purchased from the right institutions. She'd been doing it secretly, without recognition or compensation, using her own materials and methods while fulfilling all her regular cleaning duties. Victor pulled out his phone and quickly researched private special education programs in the Chicago area. The most exclusive schools charged upward of $80,000 per year, and their waiting lists stretched for years. Even then, most focused on behavior modification rather than academic achievement. Rosa was delivering superior results for the price of household wages. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Emma was flourishing under Rosa's care, and Victor's response had been to remain obliviously absent, leaving Rosa to shoulder the responsibility alone while fearing discovery and potential job loss. Looking through the doorway at his daughter, animated, engaged, clearly happy, and proud of her accomplishments, Victor realized that everything was about to change. Not just his understanding of Emma's capabilities, but his entire approach to being her father. The question now was whether Rosa would trust him enough to let him be part of what she'd built, or whether his years of neglectful ignorance had cost him any chance of joining the educational journey that was transforming his daughter's life. Victor's hands trembled as he stepped back from the doorway, his Italian leather shoes silent on the marble floor. His mind reeled with calculations, not the financial projections that usually consumed his thoughts, but something far more complex and devastating. 3 years. Rosa had been with them for 2 years, which meant Emma had been capable of this level of learning for at least that long, possibly longer. How much time had been lost? How many opportunities had he missed while chasing deals in Singapore and London and Dubai? He needed air, space to think, but as he turned to retreat to his study, his foot caught the edge of his briefcase. The leather case skidded across the floor with a harsh scraping sound that echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. What was that? Came Emma's voice from the playroom, alert and concerned. Victor froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the partially open door, he could see Rosa's head turned toward the sound, her expression shifting from curiosity to worry in an instant. Probably just James bringing in the patio furniture, Rosa said quickly, but Victor caught the tension in her voice. The weather report said storms this afternoon, but it sounded like it came from inside, Emma persisted. And Victor was struck again by his daughter's perceptiveness, a quality he'd never noticed because he'd never bothered to listen carefully to her observations. Rosa stood up, smoothing her uniform. "Stay here with your books, Pequeña. I'll go check." Panic shot through Victor. If Rosa found him lurking outside the playroom, eavesdropping on her lessons, she'd realize he knew everything. She might stop teaching Emma, might even quit entirely. The thought of losing Rosa and losing Emma's only real teacher made his chest tighten with fear. He heard Rosa's footsteps approaching the door and did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed his briefcase and strode quickly toward the front foyer, making enough noise to suggest he'd just arrived home. "Mr. Blackwood?" Rosa appeared in the hallway, her face a mask of professional composure, but Victor could see the slight widening of her eyes, the way her hands clasped nervously in front of her uniform. "You're home early, sir." Flight was delayed, then rescheduled. The lie came easily, too easily. "I decided to cut the trip short and handle things from here." Rosa nodded, but Victor noticed she'd positioned herself between him and the playroom, as if protecting something precious. "Emma's having her quiet time. She's been very good today." Quiet time. Code for the intensive educational sessions Victor now knew were happening daily in his own home. The irony was staggering. He'd been paying for Emma to have quiet time, while Rosa provided her with a world-class education in secret. "How has she been while I was away?" Victor asked, studying Rosa's face carefully. "Any Progress with the new therapy techniques Dr. Peterson recommended. A shadow crossed Rosa's features, so brief that Victor might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so intently. Emma is... She's doing well, Mr. Blackwood, very well. There was something in the way she said it, a careful emphasis that suggested layers of meaning Victor had never bothered to explore before. How many times had Rosa tried to tell him about Emma's progress, only to have him brush past with a distracted nod and a hurried exit? Rosa? Emma's voice drifted from the playroom. Can we finish our geography lesson? I want to learn about where you grew up. Geography lesson? Victor felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet. Rosa's eyes went wide with alarm, and she took a quick step backward. Emma, I need to help your daddy get settled first, Rosa called, her voice slightly strained. We can continue your quiet time later. But Emma appeared in the playroom doorway, her face bright with enthusiasm, clutching what looked like a handmade world map. Daddy, you're home. Look, I made a map, and I found Guatemala, where Rosa is from, and I can show you all the countries I know now. Victor stared at his daughter, really looked at her, and felt like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Emma wasn't exhibiting the repetitive behaviors or avoidance that characterized most of his interactions with her. Instead, she was making direct eye contact, speaking in complex sentences, and displaying excitement about learning that he'd never witnessed during any of her professional therapy sessions. You made a map? Victor managed to say. Rosa helped me, but I did most of it myself. Emma held up her creation proudly. It was clearly homemade. Construction paper continents glued to poster board, with countries labeled in Emma's careful handwriting. But it was accurate, detailed, and obviously the result of serious study. Want to see? I know where Africa is and Asia, and Rosa taught me about the Pacific Ocean. Rosa looked like she might faint. Her face had gone completely pale, and Victor could see her calculating how much trouble she was in. How quickly she could pack her things if he decided to fire her on the spot. Emma, Rosa said quietly, remember what we talked about. Sometimes learning activities are just between us, but Daddy should know. Emma interrupted, her voice rising with excitement. Look, Daddy, I can read the countries. Guatemala, Mexico, United States, Canada. She began pointing to each country on her map, pronouncing the names with careful precision. Victor felt his throat close up. Emma wasn't just recognizing a few sight words. She was reading geographical names, understanding spatial relationships, demonstrating knowledge that exceeded what many middle school students could achieve. Emma, he said carefully, kneeling down to her eye level, this is incredible work. How long have you been studying geography? Emma looked uncertainly at Rosa, then back at her father. Rosa says we're not supposed to call it studying because that sounds like work, but we do map lessons every Tuesday and Thursday after breakfast. I know 43 countries now. Do you want to hear them all? 43 countries. Victor closed his eyes briefly, trying to process this information. His daughter, who supposedly had severe limitations in learning and retention, had memorized 43 countries and could identify them on a map. Yes, he said, his voice hoarse. I would love to hear them all. What followed was a geography recitation that would have impressed any elementary school teacher. Emma didn't just name countries. She shared facts about them, compared their sizes, talked about their climates and famous landmarks. She knew that Egypt had pyramids, that China had a Great Wall, that Brazil was famous for its rainforest. With each fact Emma shared, Victor felt his understanding of his daughter and of Rosa shift more dramatically. This wasn't random memorization. This was systematic, comprehensive education delivered with skill and passion. Rosa makes learning fun, Emma confided to Victor. She doesn't make me sit still for a long time like the other teachers. We play games and tell stories and go on adventures in my imagination. Yesterday we pretended to be explorers, discovering new continents. Victor looked up at Rosa, who was standing frozen by the doorway, her face a mixture of pride and terror. She'd been caught red-handed, providing his daughter with an education that far exceeded anything the expensive specialists had achieved. And she was clearly expecting to be fired for overstepping her boundaries. Instead, Victor did something that shocked them both. He began to applaud. The sound of clapping echoed through the hallway, and Emma giggled with delight. "Are you proud of me, Daddy?" "Emma," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am more proud of you than you could ever know. And Rosa," he stood up slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "We need to talk." The fear in Rosa's eyes intensified, and Victor realized she was preparing for the worst-case scenario. He was the millionaire employer who discovered his maid had been secretly educating his daughter without permission. In her mind, this could only end one way, but Victor had other plans entirely. "Emma," he said gently, "could you show me more of your schoolwork? I want to see everything you've been learning." Emma's face absolutely glowed. "Really? You want to see my reading books and my math worksheets and my story journal? I want to see it all. But first I need to have a very important conversation with Rosa. Is that okay?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Rosa, Daddy wants to know about my learning. This is the best day ever." As Emma skipped back toward the playroom to gather her materials, Victor turned to face Rosa Martinez, the quiet maid from Guatemala who had been transforming his daughter's life in secret, was about to discover that her world was about to change as dramatically as his own. Victor waited until Emma had disappeared into her playroom, the sound of her excited rummaging through papers and books creating a backdrop to what he knew would be the most important conversation of his life. Rosa stood motionless in the hallway, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her uniform that her knuckles had gone white. "Rosa," Victor said quietly, "please sit down." She shook her head quickly. "Mr. Blackwood, I can explain." "Sit down," he repeated, his tone gentler but firm. "Please." Reluctantly, Rosa perched on the edge of one of the antique chairs that lined the hallway, her posture rigid with anxiety. Victor studied her face, really looked at her for perhaps the first time since she'd started working for his family. What he saw wasn't the quiet, unremarkable domestic worker he'd taken for granted, but an intelligent, educated woman who'd been hiding her light under a bushel for 2 years. "How long have you been teaching, Emma?" he asked directly. Rosa's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sir, I never meant to overstep. I was just trying to keep her occupied while I worked, and she seemed so eager to learn." "How long, Rosa?" She took a shaky breath. "About 18 months. It started small, just showing her letters while I dusted her room. But she picked things up so quickly, and she seemed so hungry for more, and I thought—" Her voice trailed off. "You thought what?" "I thought she was capable of much more than anyone realized." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Mr. Blackwood, Emma is incredibly intelligent. Her autism doesn't diminish her ability to learn. It just changes how she processes information. With the right approaches, the right materials, she can achieve anything any other child her age can achieve, maybe more." Victor felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you telling me that my daughter, who multiple specialists have evaluated as having severe learning limitations, is actually academically gifted?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "I'm telling you that Emma has been reading at a 4th grade level for 6 months. She can solve algebraic word problems that would challenge 6th graders. She writes poetry that would impress high school English teachers. She's teaching herself Spanish by listening to me speak it. And yesterday she asked me questions about quantum physics after we read a children's book about space." The words hit Victor like physical blows. Each revelation forced him to confront another failure, another missed opportunity, another moment when he'd chosen business over his daughter's boundless potential. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rosa looked at him with something approaching disbelief. "When, Mr. Blackwood? When would I have told you? You leave before Emma wakes up and come home after she's asleep. When you are here, you barely acknowledge her existence beyond asking if she had her therapy appointments. I tried to mention her progress several times, but you would nod and walk away to take another phone call." The accusation stung because it was completely accurate. Victor thought back to the countless times Rosa might have tried to share Emma's achievements, only to be brushed off by his preoccupation with mergers and acquisitions. The specialists, Dr. Peterson, the developmental team, they all said they were wrong. Rosa's voice grew stronger, more confident. Not about Emma having autism, but about what that means for her potential. They see a diagnosis and immediately lower expectations instead of finding different pathways to learning. Emma doesn't learn the way neurotypical children do, but that doesn't mean she can't learn. It means we need to be smarter about how we teach her. Victor ran his hands through his hair, trying to process the magnitude of what Rosa was telling him. You said we need to be smarter. You're a professional educator, aren't you? Rosa nodded slowly. I have a master's degree in special education from Universidad de San Carlos in Guatemala. I specialized in working with children on the autism spectrum and children with learning differences. Before I came to America, I ran a school for exceptional children in Guatemala City. Jesus Christ! Victor stared at her in shock. You're not a maid at all. You're a master teacher, and I've been paying you to clean my house. I needed work, Mr. Blackwood. My credentials weren't recognized here, my English wasn't perfect, and I had no references. Domestic work was the only job I could find. But when I saw Emma, when I realized what she was capable of, Rosa wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I couldn't just ignore her potential. Every day I watched her struggle with therapists who didn't understand her, who were trying to fix her instead of teaching her. I had to do something. So you created an entire school in my house. I created hope in your house, Rosa corrected. Emma was disappearing into herself because no one believed she could learn. Now she writes stories about her dreams, solves problems that challenge her mind, and asks questions about everything from ancient history to modern technology. She's not broken, Mr. Blackwood. She never was. She was just waiting for someone to see who she really is. Victor felt like the world was spinning around him. Every assumption he'd made about his daughter, about Rosa, about what was possible, had been shattered in the span of a single afternoon. Daddy! Rosa! Emma's voice called from the playroom. Come see. I organized all my school stuff. Victor looked at Rosa. What happens now? I suppose you fire me and find someone else to clean your house, Rosa said quietly. Someone who won't overstep boundaries by believing in your daughter. Rosa, Victor said. His voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Stand up. She rose slowly, her entire body tense with anticipation of dismissal. Instead, Victor extended his hand to her. My name is Victor Blackwood, and I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I also owe you a job offer. Rosa stared at his outstretched hand in confusion. I don't understand. I'm offering you a position as Emma's private tutor and educational coordinator, full-time, with a salary commensurate with your qualifications and the incredible results you've achieved with my daughter. Mr. Blackwood, $120,000 a year to start, Victor continued. Plus benefits, plus a budget for any educational materials or experiences Emma needs. I want you to design a complete curriculum for her, taking her as far academically as her abilities will allow. Rosa's eyes went wide. You're serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Rosa, you've given my daughter back to me. You've shown me that the little girl I thought I'd lost when Catherine died has been here all along, just waiting for someone to unlock her potential. There's no amount of money that could adequately compensate you for what you've done. But I'd like to try. But I'm not certified in Illinois. I don't have the proper documentation. Leave that to me. I have lawyers who specialize in immigration and credential recognition. If you're willing to stay and continue teaching Emma, I'll make sure you have everything you need to do it legally and officially. Rosa looked like she might collapse. You want me to stay? As Emma's teacher? I want you to be whatever Emma needs you to be. Teacher, mentor, advocate. I want you to help me understand my daughter the way you do. And Rosa? Victor's voice grew thick with emotion. I want you to help me learn how to be the father Emma deserves, instead of the absent workaholic who almost missed her entire childhood. Tears were streaming down Rosa's face now. "Mr. Blackwood, you don't know what this means." "Victor," he corrected. "If you're going to be Emma's teacher, and if you're going to help me learn how to be her father, I think we should start with first names." Before Rosa could respond, Emma burst into the hallway carrying an armload of notebooks, worksheets, books, and art projects. "Look, this is my reading journal, and these are my math problems. And this is a story I wrote about a dragon who learns to count. And these are my science experiments that Rosa helps me with." The materials scattered across the marble floor, months and months of careful, systematic education that had been happening under Victor's nose while he'd been consumed with quarterly reports and market analyses. "Emma," Victor said, kneeling down among the papers, "this is incredible. Would you like to show me how you do your lessons? Would you teach me what you've been learning?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You want to do school with us?" "If Rosa will let me," Victor said, looking up at the woman who had transformed his daughter's life. "I would love nothing more than to do school with you." "Rosa, can Daddy join our school?" Emma asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Rosa looked from Emma to Victor, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled. Not the polite, professional smile she'd always worn, but a genuine expression of joy and hope. "I think," Rosa said carefully, "that our school just got its first parent volunteer." Emma clapped her hands together. "This is the best day ever. Rosa, can we start Daddy with the easy books, or do you think he's ready for chapter books?" Rosa laughed. The same wonderful sound Victor had heard from the hallway, but now directed at him instead of hidden from him. "I think your daddy is ready for whatever you want to teach him, Pequeña." And as Victor knelt on the floor of his mansion, surrounded by the evidence of his daughter's remarkable capabilities and the proof of Rosa Martinez's extraordinary dedication, he realized that he was about to receive the education of his lifetime, not in corporate strategy or financial planning, but in the far more important subjects of patience, wonder, and unconditional love. "Where should we start?" Victor asked his daughter, and for the first time in 3 years, he had nowhere else he'd rather be than right here, learning alongside the two most remarkable teachers he'd ever had the privilege to meet. Emma picked up a simple picture book and settled cross-legged on the floor beside her father. "Let's start with this one, Daddy. It's about a little seed that grows into something beautiful when someone takes care of it and believes in it." As Emma began to read, her clear voice filling the hallway with words of growth and possibility, Victor understood that his daughter wasn't the only one who'd been planted and nurtured by Rosa Martinez's patient care. He too had been given the chance to grow into something better than he'd been before, not just a successful businessman, but a father who finally understood that the greatest investment he could ever make was in the brilliant, beautiful, extraordinary child who had been waiting her whole life for him to come home and join her world. Rosa settled onto the floor with them, creating a small circle of learning and love in the grand hallway of the Blackwood mansion. And Victor knew that this was just the beginning of the most important education any of them would ever receive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.